The flight was just another routine journey. The passengers settled into their seats with the usual murmurs of small talk and the sound of seat belts clicking into place as the plane slowly began to taxi down the runway. But there was something different about this flight, something unspoken that hung in the air like a quiet storm. It wasn't obvious at first, but the young flight attendant felt at the moment she stepped into the cabin a subtle discomfort. She couldn't quite shake off the elderly woman at the back of the plane. Was an enigma. Her presence was calm, almost too calm, like she was a passenger for a different time. Her frail hands gently folded in her lap. She looked peaceful enough, yet there was an aura around her, a stillness, that made the flight attendant pause, just for a split second. As she walked by, the woman's eyes met hers. For just a fleeting moment, the attendant thought nothing of it at first, just another passenger, nothing unusual. But that quiet moment lingered in her mind as she moved on to assist the other travelers. The cabin filled with the usual sounds of people settling in, chatting amongst themselves, children playing with their toys or pressing their faces against the windows, eagerly awaiting the flight. But all the while the elderly woman sat quietly. Her eyes never left the flight attendant, not in an obvious way, but in a way that seemed to pierce right through her. Every time she glanced back, she caught the woman's gaze. But there was no request for help, no sign of distress, no indication of any need at all, just that steady stare that seemed to carry some hidden weight. The flight attendant told herself it was nothing to worry about yet. The feeling persisted that she should have paid more attention, but she quickly dismissed it. There were plenty of other passengers to attend to. After all, she had a job to do, and the elderly woman looked perfectly fine. No one needed anything from her, so the flight attendant moved on. As the flight progressed, the woman remained still as the flight attendant moved up and down the aisle, taking drink orders and making small talk with the passengers around her. The elderly woman seemed almost completely detached from the world around her, as if she were existing in a quiet bubble, while everyone else hurried about. There was something strange in the way she simply observed, like she was watching something unfold. She never looked uncomfortable, never asked for anything, not even a pillow or blanket, which seemed odd for someone of her age. But then again, it wasn't unusual to encounter passengers who preferred solitude on a flight. Perhaps she was simply lost in her thoughts, or had already traveled this path many times before. The flight attendant found herself distracted by the woman's eyes, those sharp, piercing eyes that never seemed to break their gaze. Every time she glanced in the woman's direction, it was as if the elderly passenger was silently watching her every move. But the attendant told herself that it was just a coincidence, just her imagination running wild. After all, she had seen hundreds of faces during her years in the air, and none of them had ever left this strange feeling behind. None of them had ever made her feel so seen. The longer the flight went on, the more intense the feeling became, as if the elderly woman knew something the flight attendant didn't. Perhaps it was just her overactive imagination playing tricks. Or maybe there was something in the air that day, something unspoken, something that made the flight attendant nervous. Without even understanding why, she walked past the woman again. Her eyes met the attendant's once more, and for just a second the flight attendant felt her heart skip a beat. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sudden unease that she couldn't place. Something about the way the woman held her gaze made her question everything she had assumed about this flight. Was it just another ordinary trip, or was there something hidden beneath the surface, something important that she hadn't noticed before? As the woman remained perfectly still and quiet, a subtle tension grew in the air. The flight attendant had no idea yet, but in the space between those unspoken glances lay a mystery waiting to unravel. The flight continued as normal, at least it seemed that way on the surface, but the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She passed the elderly woman's seat again, and this time there was a subtle shift in the air. The woman hadn't moved since the start of the flight, her frail hands still clasped tightly around her purse, her eyes never leaving the attendant. When she glanced in her direction, It wasn't an aggressive stare, but there was something unsettling about it, almost as if the elderly woman was watching her, carefully studying her actions, from a distance yet. She said nothing, she did nothing, just remained there like a silent observer. The attendant moved past again as she checked on passengers along the aisle, offering snacks and drinks. All the while she could feel the woman's gaze following her in her peripheral vision. She couldn't help but feel a little nervous, something in the pit of her stomach churned. But she brushed it off. Maybe she was imagining things, or maybe the woman's silence had simply made her hyper-aware of every tiny detail on the plane. But then, as she turned to grab a drink from the cart, she caught the elderly woman's eyes once more. The stare this time was stronger and more deliberate. It was as if the woman was silently telling her that she knew something that the flight attendant didn't. But the attendant quickly turned away, focusing on the next passenger, hoping to dismiss the odd sensation that had started to grow inside her. She pushed the thought out of her mind and continued with her duties, but deep down she knew something wasn't quite right. The woman had not made a sound since the start of the flight, and yet her presence was starting to feel like an unspoken weight. The flight attendant could feel it pressing down on her with every step she took, every turn she made, as though she were being silently judged. But what was it that this woman could possibly know that would make her feel so uneasy? The attendant kept telling herself it was nothing, that she was just being paranoid. After all, she had dealt with difficult passengers before, passengers who demanded too much or were overly critical. But this felt different. This wasn't an angry glare or a demanding look. It was something more subtle, something more patient. Finally, the elderly woman pressed the call button. It was quiet at first, just a soft buzz. But in that moment, the flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She was still busy with another passenger. And for a second she hesitated. What if the woman needed something? What if this was finally a chance to address the unspoken tension between them? But the attendant didn't immediately respond. She had other things to do, passengers to attend to. She kept moving down the aisle, but that tiny buzzing sound kept echoing in her ears, a constant reminder that the woman needed her, but didn't ask for her attention directly. It was odd, really, the way she had waited so long to make the call. It made the attendant feel as if she were being tested, like the elderly woman was giving her a chance to make the first move. Yet the flight attendant couldn't understand why she hadn't done so herself. Why hadn't the woman just spoken up earlier? She'd have been perfectly capable of doing so after all. But instead, she had waited and watched, and now, when the attendant finally moved toward her seat, she still said nothing. She only looked up at her with that same knowing gaze, her eyes never leaving the flight attendant's face, as if she were silently waiting for her to speak first. And in that moment, the attendant felt her own pulse quicken. She knew she had to approach, but she was reluctant to break the silence, the strange unspoken tension that had hung between them for the entire flight. It was in the air, now heavy and thick. She could feel it in her chest with every breath she took. She reached the woman's seat and stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of what this was even about. The elderly woman simply looked up at her, her eyes piercing, yet calm. The attendant cleared her throat, preparing herself for whatever was about to unfold. But the woman remained silent, just staring, waiting for the attendant to break the silence first. And that was when she felt it, the realization that she had missed something important, that she had overlooked something crucial. But she couldn't put her finger on what it was yet. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between the flight attendant and the elderly woman grew thicker with each passing second. The attendant could feel it in her bones, the strange sense that something was about to shift, something important. But she couldn't put her finger on it. She moved down the aisle again, pretending to check on the other passengers, trying to focus on anything other than the woman at the back of the plane. But every time she glanced in the woman's direction, she found those sharp eyes locked onto hers. The gaze never wavered. Even when the attendant averted her eyes, it was as if the elderly woman was silently demanding her attention. Without saying a word, the attendant couldn't understand why. But she felt as though the woman was watching her every move, every tiny detail, and it made her skin crawl a little. The woman's stillness was unsettling. She didn't shift in her seat or even look away. She remained perfectly composed. Even though the flight was nearing its end, the cabin was starting to feel warmer as the lights flickered softly overhead. The air around them seemed to hum with unspoken words. The flight attendant kept moving, but her steps felt heavier now. Like she was walking through a fog, her mind wandered back to the strange interaction earlier, the woman's call for help that had gone ignored. But why hadn't the woman pressed the issue? Why hadn't she demanded something from her? Why had she waited so long for the attendant to finally acknowledge her presence? What was it about this elderly passenger that made her feel so observed? The flight attendant passed by the woman's seat again, but this time she lingered for a moment too long. The woman's eyes met hers, and in that instant the attendant felt an odd knot twist in her stomach. She couldn't shake the sensation that there was something more to the woman, something beyond her age, something hidden beneath the quiet facade. The elderly woman's lips twitched, as though she were about to speak, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she simply nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was as if she were silently acknowledging something between them, something the attendant still didn't fully understand. But the weight of that silent exchange felt heavy. It was like a secret was being shared in the briefest of moments, and the attendant had no idea what it was. For the rest of the flight, the attendant kept stealing glances at the woman, trying to decipher what was happening, but the elderly woman remained perfectly still, as if she were a part of the plane itself, a fixture among the seats and luggage. Yet no matter how many times the attendant looked her way, the woman's eyes never faltered. They were constant, like a lighthouse guiding her through the uncertainty of the moment. The flight attendant found herself caught in the woman's gaze, unable to break free. Each glance felt like a tug on her soul, a pull that left her feeling off balance, unsettled. Even though the woman never spoke again, it was clear that the encounter wasn't over. It was far from it. As the plane began its descent, the attendant went through her final checks, preparing the cabin for landing. Her movements were mechanical, now almost robotic, but her mind kept drifting back to the woman at the back of the plane, to those piercing eyes that never seemed to blink. It was as if the woman was waiting for something, perhaps waiting for her to understand something that had been left unspoken, waiting for her to finally realize just who she really was. And in that moment, the flight attendant felt a strange sense of urgency. It was as if time was running out, as if the answer was just out of reach. But she couldn't grasp it, no matter how hard she tried. She moved back down the aisle, trying to focus on the task at hand. But her heart was racing, her palms were starting to sweat as the seconds ticked down to landing. The cabin grew quieter as passengers gathered their things and prepared to exit the plane, but the elderly woman stayed seated, watching the attendant one last time. And in that moment, something clicked deep in the flight attendant's mind. Though she still didn't know what it was, she felt the tiniest spark of realization, something that would change everything. But before she could process it, the plane touched down, and the usual sounds of disembarkation began to fill the air. The attendant's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred, something she would soon discover, but wasn't yet ready for. The final stages of the flight seemed to drag on for the flight attendant as she moved down the aisles, checking seat belts and preparing the cabin for landing. Her mind was still preoccupied with the elderly woman at the back of the plane. The woman's calm presence had become a looming figure in her thoughts, like a shadow that wouldn't disappear no matter how much she tried to focus on the tasks at hand. She could feel the weight of those unblinking eyes following her every movement. Even as she assisted passengers, her heart beat a little faster every time she passed the woman's seat. Yet she couldn't bring herself to stop and talk to her. The tension in the air was palpable, and she didn't know how to break it without feeling foolish or like she was overreacting. As the plane descended into the final stages of its journey, the cabin grew quieter, and the flight attendant found herself walking down the aisle for the last time, glancing over the passengers as they prepared to gather their belongings. The elderly woman still sat motionless, her eyes never leaving her. The flight attendant felt the pull again, the need to turn and confront the silence that had settled between them. But this time there was something different about it. The quiet was no longer just silence. It had become a presence, something almost tangible, something that weighed heavily on her chest. She could feel the elderly woman's stare from across the cabin, like a heavy blanket that draped over her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She passed by the woman again, and this time the elderly woman did not simply stare. She spoke. Her voice was low, but clear, cutting through the hum of the cabin with surprising authority. The words were simple, but they struck the flight attendant hard. "Excuse me." It was all she said, but the way she said it made the attendant stop in her tracks. It was as though the woman had been waiting for her to finally turn around, like she knew the moment would come when the attendant would finally acknowledge her presence after all this time of being ignored and dismissed. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for just a moment, but then turned to face the woman, her breath caught in her throat. As she took a step closer, the woman's eyes were still locked onto her, steady and intense. The flight attendant opened her mouth to say something, to apologize perhaps, but no words came out. Instead, she found herself simply staring back at the woman, feeling a strange sense of discomfort, as if she were being judged in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if the woman was waiting for her to realize something that the attendant hadn't yet seen. "I need nothing from you," the woman continued, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "But you will know who I am soon enough." The words hung in the air between them like a promise that the flight attendant wasn't ready to understand. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. But before she could gather her thoughts, the elderly woman slowly began to rise from her seat in a way that seemed almost effortless for someone of her age. She moved with a fluid grace that belied her frailty, and the flight attendant couldn't help but notice the way she carried herself, her posture impeccable, her every movement deliberate, as if she were accustomed to commanding attention without speaking a single word. The attendant watched as the woman made her way down the aisle, her steps slow but confident, each one measured with a quiet dignity that seemed to make the rest of the cabin fall away, as if the rest of the passengers were merely an afterthought. She felt a strange mix of awe and unease watching her leave, and for a brief moment she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the encounter. But it was no use. The woman was gone before the flight attendant could say a word, and the cabin slowly returned to its usual noise as passengers began to gather their things and prepare to exit the plane. But the attendant stood frozen for a moment longer, her heart still racing, her thoughts still swirling. There was something about that woman, something that made the flight attendant question everything she had known up until that point, something that made her realize she had missed something important that she couldn't yet understand. And in that moment, the reality of the situation hit her with full force. The woman had not just been a quiet elderly passenger. She had been someone important, someone who had quietly observed everything around her, and the flight attendant had no idea who she really was. The plane finally landed with a soft jolt, and the seatbelt sign flickered off as the cabin filled with the usual hum of passengers gathering their things and preparing to leave. But for the flight attendant, there was no sense of closure, no sense of completion, only a strange void that seemed to swallow her thoughts. She moved mechanically through the motions of preparing the cabin for disembarkation, yet her mind kept drifting back to the elderly woman. The words she had spoken so calmly, "You will know who I am soon enough," they echoed in her mind with an almost haunting finality. It was as if the woman had known something the attendant didn't, and that knowledge was slowly eating away at her. She tried to focus on the task at hand, helping passengers with their overhead bins, reminding them to take their belongings, but the lingering sensation of the woman's gaze made everything feel distant, like she was going through the motions without fully being present. Her thoughts kept circling back to that moment, when the woman had looked up at her with those piercing eyes, the way she had spoken so quietly yet with an undeniable authority, as if she had been more than just an ordinary passenger. But what had she meant by those words? Who was she really? As the final passengers made their way off the plane, the flight attendant found herself standing near the back of the cabin, staring out the window. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of the elderly woman slowly walking down the jet bridge and disappearing into the crowd, her frail figure blending in with the others. But something about the way she walked lingered in the attendant's mind, her movements graceful despite her age. And yet there was something else there, a certain quiet power that the flight attendant couldn't quite place. But it had been there. It was in the way the woman held herself, in the way she commanded the space around her, even without saying a word. The flight attendant knew she couldn't just let it go. There was something important, that she had missed, something that she needed to understand. But how could she have known who the woman really was when she had never given any indication of her true identity? What if she had been someone famous, someone important, and the attendant had treated her like any other passenger? It was embarrassing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the situation, something she wasn't seeing. After the flight was officially over and the cabin was cleared, the attendant grabbed her phone and quickly searched for news stories about anyone connected to the flight, anything that could give her a clue about the elderly woman. And that's when she saw a headline about a former Supreme Court judge who had recently retired and was seen traveling across the country alone. The name was familiar. The judge had made headlines years ago for her groundbreaking decisions in civil rights cases, and her work in the court had changed the lives of so many. But why hadn't the flight attendant recognized her sooner? The woman's name was Ruth Daniels, and just as the attendant read the article, our hearts sank, because there was no mistaking it. The elderly woman on the plane had been Ruth Daniels, the once powerful figure who had shaped so much of the nation's legal landscape. The realization hit her hard, and fast, like a punch to the gut. She had stood there in the presence of one of the most influential people in the country, and had treated her like just another passenger. She felt a rush of guilt and embarrassment flood her chest, but at the same time a sense of awe settled over her. How had she missed it? How had she not recognized the quiet power that radiated from the woman? How had she not seen the connection sooner? The flight attendant sat down for a moment, her hands shaking slightly as she processed what had just unfolded. She had always treated every passenger the same, regardless of their background or status. But now she saw how easy it was to overlook the significance of someone's presence, especially when they carried themselves with such quiet dignity and strength. Ruth Daniels had never demanded special treatment, yet somehow her quiet authority had been enough to leave an indelible mark on the flight attendant's mind. She now understood that the woman hadn't been testing her or trying to make her feel guilty, but rather she had been giving her a lesson in humility, in recognizing the value of every person, no matter how ordinary they seemed on the surface. The flight attendant sat still for what seemed like an eternity, her thoughts racing over and over again as the weight of the discovery pressed down on her like a heavy fog. Ruth Daniels. The name echoed in her mind as she stared blankly at her phone. She had been so close to the woman the entire time, yet had never realized who she truly was. It was a crushing thought. How many times had she walked past someone important, only to treat them as just another face in the crowd? It was a humbling lesson, a painful one, that made her feel small and insignificant, as though she had missed something crucial right in front of her eyes. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen as she read more about Ruth Daniels. She had been a powerful force in the world of law, one of the most respected figures to ever sit on the Supreme Court. Yet here she had been quietly traveling alone on a commercial flight, just like any other passenger, and no one had recognized her. Not a single person had given her more than a passing glance. The flight attendant had treated her with the same indifference she would any other elderly woman on a plane. But now she couldn't stop thinking about the weight of that missed opportunity. What could have been if she had known who the woman was? What would she have said to her? How would she have treated her differently? Her mind raced as she recalled their interactions from the flight, every small moment. The brief exchange of glances, the way the woman had never asked for anything yet, had carried herself with such quiet dignity. It all made sense now. Ruth Daniels had not needed anyone's help. She had been perfectly capable on her own. But the flight attendant's gut told her that the woman had not just been there to be left alone. She had been there for a reason, something the attendant had yet to figure out, and it gnawed at her like a puzzle with missing pieces. Suddenly she felt a strange compulsion to do something, anything, to make up for her ignorance. She couldn't just let it end there, couldn't just walk away from this encounter without understanding the purpose behind it. Maybe it was a simple mistake. Maybe it was fate pushing her into a moment of self-awareness. But she needed to know more. She needed to understand why Ruth Daniels had been on that flight, why she had been so patient, why she had been so quiet. The attendant quickly stood up, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door. She couldn't sit still anymore. The weight of the situation was too much, and she needed answers. She had to find out what had happened after the flight had landed, where Ruth Daniels had gone, what her next move would be. She had no idea what she was going to say or how to even approach someone of such stature. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no way she could just let the woman slip away from her life without learning something from her. She walked out of the terminal feeling a sense of urgency pulse through her veins. She searched through the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elderly woman, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The crowd had scattered, and Ruth Daniels had vanished into it without a trace. The attendant's heart sank a little as she stood there feeling lost and unsure of where to even begin searching. How could she find someone as elusive as Ruth Daniels, someone who had spent a lifetime in the public eye, but had chosen to remain invisible on this day? She stepped outside into the cool air and paused for a moment, letting her thoughts settle down. But the more she stood there, the more she realized something strange, something unsettling. The woman had not left in a hurry. She had simply walked away without a glance back, as though she were fully aware of who she was and what she meant to the world, yet had no need to prove it to anyone, no need to announce her presence. She had been a mystery, not because she had hidden her identity, but because she had allowed the world to see her in a different way, a way that demanded respect without the need for recognition. As the attendant stood there pondering the situation, her phone buzzed suddenly. A new notification appeared on her screen. It was a news alert. Ruth Daniels had just been spotted at a nearby cafe, sitting alone in a corner with a cup of coffee. The attendant's heart raced as she read the headline: Former Supreme Court Judge Ruth Daniels seen alone in public for the first time in years. She didn't know what to do with this information, but something deep within her told her this was her chance. This was the moment she had been waiting for, a chance to speak with Ruth Daniels and finally understand the purpose of their strange and silent encounter. The attendant didn't waste a second after reading the news alert. Her heart was pounding as she quickly made her way toward the cafe. The urgency in her steps matched the intensity of her thoughts. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random encounter, more than just a chance meeting on a plane. Something inside her told her that Ruth Daniels had been waiting for her to understand something that would change the way she saw the world, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. As she entered the cafe, the warm scent of coffee filled the air, and the low murmur of conversations blended with the soft jazz music playing in the background. She scanned the room quickly, looking for a familiar face, and there she was, sitting alone in the far corner of the cafe. Ruth Daniels, the former Supreme Court judge, sitting as casually as any other elderly woman in the room, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on the table. She was sipping her coffee slowly, her eyes focused on something in front of her, though the attendant couldn't tell what it was. But there was something serene about her presence, something that made her stand out even in a room full of people. The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment. She had never felt so out of place in her life. The weight of what she was about to do was almost overwhelming. But there was no turning back now. She walked toward the table, her legs feeling heavy with each step, her heart thumping in her chest louder now than it had ever been. Before, she wasn't sure what to expect. But she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. This wasn't going to be a simple exchange of pleasantries. This was something bigger than both of them. When Ruth Daniels saw her approach, she didn't look surprised or startled. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. She simply set her coffee cup down and looked up at the flight attendant with the same calm, but piercing gaze that had unsettled her on the plane. It was as if she had been expecting her all along, as if she had known this moment would come. The flight attendant stopped in front of her, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to even begin. "I was wondering when you'd come," Ruth Daniels said, her voice as smooth as ever, but with a weight behind it that made the attendant's breath catch in her throat. "I've been watching you ever since the flight." The words hung in the air between them, and the attendant stood there frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Had the woman really been watching her all along? Was that why she had felt so uneasy, so scrutinized on the plane? The flight attendant took a seat across from Ruth Daniels, still trying to gather her thoughts. She had so many questions, so many things she wanted to ask. But the only thing that came out of her mouth was, "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Ruth smiled a little, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of understanding, one that said she knew exactly what the attendant was feeling and why she was struggling to find the right words. "Because you weren't ready," Ruth replied simply, her voice calm and steady. "You wouldn't have understood then, not the way you do now." The words sent a shiver down the attendant's spine as she realized the truth in them. She hadn't been ready for the lesson Ruth Daniels had been trying to teach her, not until now. The flight attendant sat back in her chair, taking a moment to process what Ruth had said. "But why me?" she finally asked. "Why choose me of all people?" Ruth's gaze softened as she looked at her. The weight of the years she had lived and the experiences she had witnessed seemed to settle in her eyes as she answered. "Because you are someone who still has the capacity to learn." Ruth's voice was quiet now, almost reflective. "In this world, there are so few who take the time to see beyond the surface, to understand the deeper truths that lie beneath. And you," she paused, "you're still searching for those truths, aren't you?" The flight attendant didn't know how to respond, but deep down she knew Ruth was right. She had spent so much of her life just moving from one task to the next, without truly understanding the world around her. And now here she was sitting across from a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding the truth of the human condition. And yet Ruth Daniels was not here to teach her about the law or justice. She was here to teach her something far more personal, something that would change her forever. "I've been waiting for someone like you to come to me." Ruth continued, her voice growing quieter. "Not because you need anything from me, but because you have the potential to see the world differently. And when you do, it will be like opening your eyes for the first time." The flight attendant sat still, absorbing every word, as if each one held a key to a door she hadn't known was there. And as she listened, she realized that this encounter wasn't a coincidence. It had been meant to happen all along. The flight attendant sat across from Ruth Daniels, feeling the weight of her words settle deep into her bones. She had always believed in hard facts, in things that could be seen, touched, and measured. But sitting there with this woman who had spent her life navigating the complexities of the law, she realized how little she understood about the real world, about the unspoken truths that lay beneath the surface of everything. Ruth's calm gaze never wavered as she waited for the flight attendant to process everything that had been said. but the attendant could feel herself slowly unraveling, trying to make sense of it all. "You're asking me to see the world differently," the flight attendant said slowly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't understand. How can I just shift my perspective like that? How do I even begin to understand what you're telling me?" Ruth smiled again, but this time it wasn't as gentle, it was sharp, like a teacher who knew the lesson had finally landed. Understanding isn't about trying to see the world in a new way. It's about learning to stop blocking the truth that's always been there, Ruth replied, her voice low and steady. "You see what's in front of you, but you don't always see what's behind it, the things that shape people's actions, the things that shape your own actions." Her words were like a mirror held up to the flight attendant's face, forcing her to confront her own assumptions, her own ignorance. The flight attendant felt a knot twist in her stomach. The idea of seeing things differently was daunting. She had spent her life thinking she understood the world, thinking she knew what mattered. But now Ruth was telling her that she had only scratched the surface, that there was so much more beneath the surface that she had never even considered. "How do you know when you're ready to see it?" the attendant asked, barely able to form the words. As she tried to wrap her mind around the concept, Ruth's eyes softened for a moment, and she leaned forward slightly, as if the words she was about to speak were meant for only the flight attendant to hear. "Because the world will show you when you're ready," Ruth said. "The truth isn't something you can force. It has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it, when you're least prepared. But the key is being willing to accept it when it comes." The flight attendant felt a chill run down her spine as she considered Ruth's words. They sounded so simple, so obvious, but at the same time they felt like a revelation, like a secret that had been hidden from her for far too long. Ruth leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving the flight attendant's face. "You've spent your whole life looking for answers, but the truth isn't something you find, it's something that finds you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And when it does, you'll know, because it will change everything you thought you knew about yourself, about the world." The flight attendant felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know if she was ready for that kind of change. What Ruth was suggesting was terrifying, but at the same time it felt inevitable, as if she had no choice but to face the truth once it had been revealed to her. But there was a part of her that was afraid of what might happen if she did, what would happen to her life, if everything she had built her understanding of the world on was suddenly upended. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "What if it's too much? What if I can't handle it?" Ruth's expression softened, and for the first time the flight attendant saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "Everyone has to decide for themselves whether they're ready to face the truth," Ruth said. "But you've already taken the first step by being here, by acknowledging that you don't know everything, by seeking something deeper than the surface of your life." She paused. "That's the hardest part. The rest will come when it's time." The flight attendant sat back in her chair, still processing what had been said, the weight of Ruth's words pressing down on her chest. But in that moment she realized something she had never truly understood before. Life wasn't about finding all the answers. It was about being open to the questions and learning to live with uncertainty. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would, but for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of peace in that uncertainty. Ruth stood up from the table, slowly gathering her things as she prepared to leave. The flight attendant watched her every movement with a mix of awe and gratitude. She had come to the cafe expecting to find answers, expecting to understand the woman who had so deeply affected her. But now she understood that the true lesson wasn't about Ruth at all. It was about her own journey and the path she still had to walk. "Thank you," the flight attendant said quietly, watching as Ruth turned to leave. For everything, Ruth turned back to her with a smile that was almost imperceptible, but full of understanding. "You'll find your way," she said before turning and walking out the door, leaving the flight attendant sitting alone at the table with a heart full of questions. and a mind wide open to the possibilities of the world.